How many breaths do you think you take in one day? No, seriously, make a guess and post it on the WhatsApp group. And before you sit there thinking to yourself, counting the number of breaths you take in one day, there's an easier way of doing it. Hint, you can start by estimating the number of breaths you take in 1 minute. Now, welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of respiration. Now, before we continue on this topic, I want you to do one thing, and that's to keep calm and take a deep breath. Firstly, because you've been through so much and you need to assure yourself they'll all be okay at the end of the day. Secondly, because today in this video, we're going to be talking about breathing. In particular, how do we breathe? What muscles are involved? What's the difference between our inspired and expired air? And how can we tell? And what causes us to breathe? What is the stimulus for breathing? Now in the textbook, these are covered from these pages. It'll be really helpful if you read them along with this video. Now let's begin with a simple experiment. How fast can you breathe? No, seriously, try breathing as fast as you can. And after a while, I think you realize that it's actually quite tiring. Well, that's because breathing involves muscular contractions. It's an energy-using process, right? It involves the contraction of muscles in your chest, which we're about to see. So what is breathing? Well, breathing refers to the muscular contractions that move air in and out of your lungs. And we saw that in our last set of notes, where we looked at the pathway that air takes when it moves from outside the body into your gas exchange system, through a series of air passages, and finally into your lungs. In particular, into your alveoli, the clusters of air sacs in your lungs. Now, this doesn't just happen automatically. No, there need to be muscular contractions to move air in and out of your lungs. Your body needs to spend energy, muscles need to contract for you to breathe in and out. Right? It's hard work. So as biologists, we have very special words to describe breathing in and breathing out. We call breathing in inhalation or inspiration, right? We call breathing out exhalation or expiration. Now, this is very different from the normal usage of the words. We always think about inspiration as woohoo, light bulb over your head. No, in biology, inspiration means breathing in. And we think of expiration as the food in our fridge going moldy. No, in biology, expiration means breathing out. Okay, so just be familiar with these two words. So what structures are involved in breathing? Well, we have two sets of structures. We have our bones and we have our muscles. And we're going to take a closer look at each of these in turn. So let's start with bones. So your chest cavity, or what we call the thoracic cavity, thoracic comes from the word thorax, which also means your chest. The chest cavity contains several bones which are important for breathing. First, we have your ribs, right? And your ribs are attached at the back of your body to your backbone. This is your backbone here, or what we call the spinal column, your backbone at the back. And the ribs are attached to the sternum in front. And these ribs are important because they help to support the chest wall. And together the ribs form the rib cage. Right? I'm sure that sounds familiar. So if you have a moment now, have a feel of your own rib cage. See if you can make out where the sternum is. So if you feel your sternum, you'll feel a part here. There's a junction where the ribs kind of divide into two halves. You have the ribs, feel your own ribs, and your spinal column, you can feel that going down your back. So these are the bones important for breathing. Now some diagrams show the bones of the chest cavity in the side view. Okay, so don't get confused. Always look for the backbone and the sternum. So in this case, here's the backbone, right? Very obvious backbone. And the sternum's in front, and here are the ribs in between. Now, rather importantly, there are two sets of muscles between your ribs, right? So between every pair of ribs, there are two sets of muscles. One, the external intercostal muscles. And two, the internal intercostal muscles. So the reason why they're called external and internal is because one is nearer the outside and one is underneath. Okay, so the external intercostal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. You can see here the muscles between the ribs. And actually, if we just look at the rib cage in this way, we can only see the external intercostal muscles because the internal ones are underneath. Right? So two sets of muscles between the ribs, and these are important, as we shall see, for breathing. And these sets of muscles, importantly, are antagonistic. Right? We've seen this word before when we looked at peristalsis. Okay, these muscles, external intercostal and internal intercostal, are antagonistic. When one contracts, the other will relax, and vice versa. Alright? So these two muscles are very important because they help to move the rib cage up and down during breathing, as we shall see in just a bit. Now, the other muscle that is really important for breathing is your diaphragm. And you often hear of people who sing talk about the diaphragm, that you should breathe into your diaphragm, use your diaphragm to sing. So here's that muscle, right? It is a dome-shaped sheet. It looks a bit like a parachute. And it can contract and relax to change the volume of your chest cavity. Now, when the diaphragm contracts, it kind of flattens out like this. So it becomes flatter and it increases the volume of this chest cavity. When it relaxes, then it will come back up in this manner. So it's interesting. It looks a bit like a parachute. So I place this picture here. So diaphragm, that's the other important muscle you need to know. So before we go into what happens during breathing in and breathing out, here's a summary of all the parts that we've learned. So you can see in this diagram, here are your ribs, right? And between your ribs, we have your external intercostal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles here on the inner side. We have the diaphragm here as well. So we're going to see how all these work together to help you breathe in and out. So to begin with, we're going to be watching a video of what happens when a person is breathing. And as you watch this video, I want you to observe when the person is breathing in, what happens to his diaphragm and what happens to his rib cage. Alright, so observe carefully. Let's go. A very well chiseled body. So he's breathing in and out. In and out. So what do you notice? Now hopefully you notice that when a person breathes in, his diaphragm will move downwards, it will contract, it will flatten, and it will move downwards. And when a person breathes in, his rib cage will move upward and outward. So this direction, upward and outward. Have a look. So breathing in, you can see the diaphragm flattens, it contracts and flattens out. And when the person breathes in, you can see his rib cage moves up and outward. So one last time, breathe in, the diaphragm will move, flatten out, and the rib cage will move upward. Alright? Okay, I don't need to see your back. Alright, so hopefully that makes sense. So the diaphragm will contract and flatten when you breathe in, and the rib cage will move upward and outward. Now we are now ready to put what we have seen in the video into words. Okay, so what happens during inspiration and inhalation? Firstly, the diaphragm contracts and flattens down. Okay, it moves downwards. Secondly, right, the external intercostal muscles will contract while the internal intercostal muscles will relax. Remember, the external intercostal and internal intercostal muscles are antagonistic. So in this case, the external ones contract while the internal ones relax. Now this together results in the rib cage moving upwards and outward, like that. So the flattening of the diaphragm and the movement of the rib cage upward and outwards both result in the volume of the thoracic cavity and lungs increasing. So the thoracic cavity is also called the chest cavity. And you can see when the rib cage moves upwards and outwards, when the diaphragm moves downwards, it causes the volume of the chest cavity and the lungs to increase. Now because the volume of the lungs increase, the air pressure in the lungs decreases. Okay, so volume and pressure have an inverse relationship. When the volume increases, the pressure inside will decrease. So because the air pressure in the lungs decrease, the atmospheric pressure, that means the pressure around us, around in the environment, is now higher than the pressure in the lungs. So air will move from a place of higher pressure in the atmosphere to a place of lower pressure in the lungs. So air therefore is forced to move into the lungs. That's inhalation. We'll now move on to exhalation. So what happens during expiration and exhalation? Well, kind of the opposite. So the first thing is that the diaphragm relaxes and it arches upwards. So now you can see the diaphragm has moved upwards, it relaxes. The external intercostal muscles will now relax while the internal intercostal muscles will contract. Okay, again, they're antagonistic. Alright, this relaxation of the external intercostal muscles and contraction of the internal intercostal muscles causes the rib cage to move downwards and inwards. So now it swings back downwards and inwards. Now together, the relaxing of the diaphragm and the movement of the rib cage downwards and inwards causes the volume of the thoracic cavity or chest cavity and the volume of the lungs to decrease. Alright, so the volume of the lungs decreases, and this increases the pressure in the lungs. Okay, you imagine like if you have some amount of gas inside here and you reduce the volume, then the pressure inside will increase. It's just like squeezing a balloon smaller, it will cause the pressure in the balloon to increase. Now, because the pressure in the lungs increase, the pressure in the lungs is now greater than the atmospheric pressure outside of you. So air is forced out. It moves from greater pressure in the lungs out to lower pressure in the atmosphere. So this is what happens during expiration or exhalation. Alright, so this is the slide just to show you an example of how the rib cage moves during breathing. Right, some people think of the movement of the rib cage like a bucket handle. So imagine a bucket handle swinging upwards like that. So if I look at the ribs from the front view, right, when I breathe in, the ribs kind of swing upwards this way like a bucket handle. So that's how you can visualize it or think about it. If I look from the side, right, when you breathe in, the rib cage will swing upwards and outwards, right? So the movement, some people describe it as like a pump handle. So imagine a pump handle moving up that way. So hopefully this helps you to kind of visualize what's happening to your rib cage during breathing. Now if at this point you're thinking to yourself, how am I ever going to remember which muscle contracts and relaxes? Keep calm and take a deep breath. One possible way to remember the intercostal muscles is by using this acronym, RICE-ERIC. And we start with RICE. RICE tells us what happens during inhalation. During inhalation, relax internal, contract external. So the internal intercostal will relax and the external intercostal will contract. And then during exhalation, we have ERIC, right? So external relax, internal contract. Right? So you can remember this because exhalation is the E, and then ERIC is an E as well. So ERIC is for exhalation and RICE is for inhalation. And you just remember this. It helps you to remember which muscles contract and relax. Now I'm just going to end off by showing you a graph of what we have seen so far. Now this graph shows you the pressure in the lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure, the lung pressure compared to atmospheric pressure during inspiration and expiration. So what do you notice? Now you can see that during inspiration, the pressure in the lungs decreases. It becomes lower than atmospheric pressure. Right? And that's what causes the air to move from the atmosphere into your lungs. And during expiration, you can see that the pressure in the lungs goes above the atmospheric pressure. And that's what causes the air to move out of the lungs into the atmosphere. So this is how some people show the pressure changes in the lungs during breathing. Right? We'll explore more of this in the practice questions. Until then, I'll see you until the next video.